The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that nobody used except me and the deer. 43 winters I'd been driving up to that place. My grandfather built the original structure in 1958. My father added the back porch the year I was born. When my wife Margaret got sick, we spent her last good summer there. She wanted to hear the loons one more time. After she passed, I kept going back. Some men go to church. I went to the cabin. That Tuesday in late October, I drove up from Asheville to winterize the place. Pull the dock, drain the pipes, cover the boats. Same routine I'd done since I was 19. I came around the last bend before the cabin and I saw the truck. A black Ford F-150, brand new by the looks of it. Parked right in front of my porch. I didn't recognize it. My son Ben drove a Subaru. My daughter-in-law Heather drove a Honda. And we were the kind of community where you didn't just show up at somebody's cabin in the off-season without calling first. I pulled in behind the Ford and sat with the engine ticking. I could see 2 sets of footprints in the soft dirt going up to the front door. I got out, slow, walked to the front of the truck, and took a picture of the Tennessee plate. 40 years working as a small-town district attorney will do that to you. You document things. You don't think about why. You just do it because you've watched too many cases fall apart for lack of one small piece of paper. I was reaching for my key when I heard the laugh. Heather's laugh, my daughter-in-law, the mother of my granddaughter Sophie. The woman my son had married 11 years ago in a chapel down in Charleston. Heather was supposed to be visiting her sister in Knoxville this week. Ben had told me so on Sunday, right before he took Sophie to Disney World. That trip had been planned for months. Sophie had a Mickey Mouse suitcase. I'd given her $200 in spending money. Then I heard a man laugh too, low, easy, the laugh of somebody who was comfortable. I took my hand off the doorknob, real slow, like I was diffusing something. I walked around to the side of the cabin where the kitchen window was. The blinds were halfway down, but the slats were tilted open. Through the gap, I could see the kitchen table where I'd eaten my dinner alone every weekend for 3 years. 2 coffee cups, a bottle of whiskey. My whiskey, the bottle I kept on top of the refrigerator. And there was Heather sitting on the lap of a man I had never seen before. Maybe 45, big shoulders, close-cropped beard going gray at the chin. He was rubbing her back and she was laughing at something he'd said. Then she leaned down and kissed him on the mouth. Slow, comfortable. Not the kiss of 2 people who just met. The kiss of 2 people who had been doing this for a long time. My knees went weak. I put a hand against the cedar siding to keep from going down. I felt water in my eyes and my chest tighten up. For a second I thought I was having a heart attack. I made myself breathe. I made myself take stock. I was 71 years old, a quarter mile from the nearest house, and what I needed in that moment was not feelings. What I needed was a plan. I backed away from the window and walked to my truck. I drove half a mile down the gravel road to the boat launch turnout where the trees would hide me. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and my heart pounding. The first thing I thought was, don't go back in there. Whatever the right move was, it wasn't a confrontation between an old man and a stranger half my age in an isolated cabin. The second thing I thought was, get evidence. I had a digital camera in my glove box, a voice recorder clipped to my belt. I turned the recorder on, walked back through the woods on the deer trail I'd cleared with my own hands when I was 40. Came up behind the woodshed. From there, I could see straight through the big window onto the back deck. They had moved outside. He had his arm around her and they were drinking and looking at the lake my grandfather had taught me to fish on. I took pictures for almost 2 hours. His face, the truck, the way she leaned into his chest like a wife, the way he reached up and tucked her hair behind her ear with a gesture so familiar and tender I knew, looking through the viewfinder, that this was not new. My back ached and my legs cramped, and at one point a hornet landed on my hand, and I had to sit perfectly still while it walked across my knuckles and flew off. I have never been more patient in my life. Eventually he stood up and they went inside. Through the kitchen window, I watched Heather wash the 2 glasses and put them back exactly where she'd found them. He straightened the throw pillows. They were careful. They'd done this before. He came out first and drove off. I got pictures of his plate from a different angle and his face through the windshield. About 10 minutes later, Heather came out, locked up with a key on her own ring, and drove off in the opposite direction. I waited a long time before I went back inside. Walked through each room slow. The whiskey bottle was back on top of the refrigerator. The cups were drying on a dish towel. If I hadn't seen what I'd seen, I would have walked in and never known a thing. I went upstairs to the guest room. The bed was made, but the comforter was tucked wrong. The pillows, on the right side, were stacked like somebody had been propped up reading. There was a long blonde hair on the pillowcase. Sophie had slept in that room every Christmas Eve since she was 3. She'd drawn pictures of the lake with crayons that were still in the nightstand drawer. And her mother had brought a stranger here and used that same bed. I went downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, put my head in my hands, and let myself feel it for exactly 1 minute, watching the second hand on the wall clock my father had hung in 1969. When the minute was up, I made myself a sandwich and started writing on a yellow legal pad. I knew what I was looking at. 40 years of prosecuting cases had shown me how it goes when a man finds out his wife is cheating and acts on the first feeling. He yells, she changes her story, hides the money, calls a lawyer, and by the time he's thinking clearly, she has a 6-month head start. I was not going to let that happen to my son. I called an old friend named Doyle. He'd been my investigator for 30 years before he retired to run a small firm out of Knoxville doing divorce work for attorneys. I gave him the plate number, described the man, and said I needed everything he could find. Then I drove home. Doyle called me back the next afternoon. The truck was registered to Pierce Holloway, 46 Maryville, Tennessee. Married 19 years, 2 kids in high school. Pierce ran a small construction company that did lake house builds and high-end remodels. He had worked on the bathroom in Ben and Heather's townhouse in Asheville 2 summers ago. 3 weeks, the crew was there. I remembered now. Heather had brought Sophie over to my house and said she couldn't stand the dust. Doyle dug deeper over the next 3 weeks. When he finally came to my house in person, he set a manila folder on my kitchen table and said, "You better sit down for this one." The affair had been going on for 2 years and 4 months. Pierce had taken Heather to hotels in Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Bristol, and once to Charleston for a long weekend she told Ben was a sales conference. There were receipts for jewelry, restaurant bills, a hotel charge from the Biltmore she'd told my son was a bachelorette party. And there was something else. Over the past 18 months, Heather had moved nearly $60,000 out of their joint accounts in small pieces. Some into a separate account Ben didn't know existed. Some to Pierce's company as supposed consulting fees. Some out as cash. I sat there looking at Doyle, and I think the only thing I said for a full minute was my God. I called my old friend Constance, the best divorce attorney I'd ever known. She read through Doyle's file in silence for 40 minutes. When she was done, she pushed her glasses up on her head and said, "Your daughter-in-law has done your son a real favor. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Adultery on its own gets you very little, but dissipation of marital assets is a different animal." She moved $60,000 of his money to support her affair. That is fraud against the marriage. We can argue that, and we can use it for a much bigger settlement. And with a child involved, a pattern of deception this deep gets framed as poor judgment and unstable home environment. We will argue for primary physical custody, and we will probably get it. But timing is everything. If she gets wind of this before he files, she hides assets, coaches the daughter, builds her own narrative. We move fast and we move quiet. I drove home and didn't sleep that night. Before I called Ben, I had one more call to make. I had been thinking about Diane Holloway for 2 weeks. There was a photograph in Doyle's file taken outside her workplace. Brown hair pulled back, tired eyes, nurse's scrubs. She worked 60 hours a week as a charge nurse on the cardiac floor. According to Doyle, she didn't know. I thought about my Margaret. If Margaret had been alive and someone was doing this to her and another person knew and sat on it for their own convenience, I would never have forgiven that person. Never. I called Diane on a Wednesday morning. She picked up on the second ring. I told her my name and that I had something she was not going to want to hear, and I was sorry for it. I told her my daughter-in-law had been having an affair with her husband for over 2 years, that I had photographs and hotel receipts and bank records, and that I was about to tell my son, and I thought she deserved to make the same choice at the same time. She was quiet for a long time. I heard her breathing. A hospital page in the background. Then she said, "I have been calling myself crazy for a year. I have been telling myself I am paranoid." I said, "You are not paranoid." She said, "Send me everything." I sent a clean copy of Doyle's file by email. Within an hour, she called back. Her voice was steadier, sharper. She said, "When are you telling your son?" I said, "Friday at 6:15. She said, "I want to do mine at the same moment. I do not want either of them to have a chance to warn the other and get a story straight. My husband will be at his shop until at least 7. I will be there at 6:15. I will bring his brother for safety because Pierce has a temper and I am not stupid." I said, "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." She said, "Mr. Whitcomb." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." I said, "You do not need to thank me." She said, "I have 2 children who are not going to have to grow up with their mother pretending. That is worth more than I can say." I hung up and cried for the first time since the cabin. Friday, Ben showed up at 6 o'clock the way he had since he was a boy. I put a glass of bourbon in front of him without asking, and sat down across from him with Doyle's folder in the chair beside me. I said, "I have something to tell you that is going to break your heart, and I would have given anything not to be the one to say it." I told him everything. The cabin. Walking away from the door. The pictures. Doyle's 3 weeks of work. Pierce, 2 years and 4 months. The hotels. The Biltmore. Then the money. He pushed back from the table and stood at the window with his back to me, shoulders shaking, crying without making any sound. I let him have it. After a couple minutes, he came back and wiped his face and said, "What do I do, Pop?" I said, "Constance is ready. We file Monday morning. But we have to move now. And Ben, at 6:15 tonight, Diane Holloway is going to walk into Pierce's shop and do the same thing you're about to do." I told him why. He nodded slow. He understood. He said, "Where is Sophie?" I said, "Your sister-in-law Mary took her to the movies." He said, "You thought of everything." I said, "I am sorry, son." He said, "Don't apologize. Don't ever apologize for what you did." He drove home. I sat on my porch and watched the last light fade, and at exactly 6:15 I imagined two confrontations happening in two different places an hour apart. Ben called at 8:45. His voice was calm. He said she is at her sister's. I told her she could come back for her things and only her things. Constance is ready for tomorrow. He paused. He said, "Pop," when she finally stopped denying it, the first thing she said was, "Who told you?" The second thing was it your father? She did not ask if I was all right. She did not say she was sorry. She asked who told me. He said, "I think you saved me from 20 more years of that." I said, "I think she saved you by showing you who she was, the moment there was no point in pretending anymore." The next 8 months were the hardest of my son's life and the proudest of mine. Constance filed Monday morning. She had everything in front of the judge before Heather retained her own attorney. The dissipation of marital assets argument hit like a brick. Heather's lawyer tried to argue the cabin photographs had been obtained by trespass. Constance pointed out with some pleasure that the cabin belonged to me, that Heather had no ownership interest in it, and that I had been documenting unauthorized use of my own property. The judge agreed. Ben got primary physical custody. The property settlement was lopsided in his favor because the court accepted that $60,000 in marital funds had been wasted to support the affair. Diane filed 2 days after Ben did. A forensic accountant went through Pierce's books and found cash pulled out for a year to cover hotels and restaurants. The IRS got interested. So did the subcontractors who hadn't been paid. Pierce's company filed for bankruptcy in March. He moved into his brother's spare room in May. Last October, I drove up to the cabin. Ben came with me and Sophie and Mary, Heather's sister, who had stayed close to the family in a way I hadn't expected. We pulled the dock and drained the pipes and covered the boats. Sophie helped me sweep the porch. She is 10 now, and she has Margaret's eyes. That night, I lit a fire in the fire pit, and Sophie roasted marshmallows, and Ben sat next to me with a beer in his hand. He looked tired, but not the way he had looked a year before. He looked tired the way men do when they are doing real work instead of surviving a lie. He said, "Pop." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I think I am going to be all right." I said, "I know you are." He watched his daughter laughing across the firelight. He said, "When Sophie is old enough, I am going to tell her what you did. Not the ugly parts. Just the part where you walked away from the door instead of through it. I want her to know her grandfather is the kind of man who thinks before he acts." I couldn't say anything to that. I just sat there and listened to the loons out on the water. A few weeks later, I got a card from Diane Holloway. We had stayed in occasional touch the way two people do when they have been through something nobody else can quite understand. She wrote that she had finalized her divorce, that her son had gotten into school on a partial scholarship, and that her daughter was applying to nursing school. She wrote, "I want you to know that the day you called me was the worst day of my life and the day I started getting it back. I will be grateful to you for as long as I live." I put the card in my desk drawer on top of the unopened 10-page letter Heather had eventually sent Ben, which he had handed to me still sealed and asked me to put somewhere. It is still there. The card outweighs it. People talk about justice like it has to be loud, like it has to involve breaking something. Mine was a phone call to a tired woman in nurse's scrubs on a Wednesday morning. That was all. Pierce paid for what Pierce did because his own wife held him to account. That is what I learned in the end. The truth, given to the right person at the right time, does more than any fist ever could. You do not have to be the one swinging. You just have to make sure the people who deserve to know. My hand was on that doorknob. Another half second, and I would have walked in there and started yelling. And Heather would have called Pierce that same night. And by the time Ben heard a single word about any of it, the truth would have been buried under 6 months of rehearsed apologies. I would have lost the only chance I had to protect him. What stopped me was not anger and not fear. It was 40 years of watching what happens when people act on the first feeling that hits them. Real strength is almost always quiet, and quiet men, when they finally move once. And the matter is settled. The cabin is closed up for winter now. Next May I will open it again. Ben will come up with Sophie. Maybe somebody new will be in his life by then. I hope so. He is too good a man to be alone. As for me, I sit on my porch most evenings with a glass of bourbon and watch the light come down through the dogwoods. I miss my wife. I love my son. I would walk through fire for my granddaughter. And if I had to do that whole long year over again, I would do it the same way. Slower, if anything. More careful. That is what fathers do. We protect our children, no matter how old they get. No matter what it costs us. No matter how long we have to stand in the woods.